Welcome back.
Welcome back, family, to Hear Us Out. I am Renee.
I am Curry.
And again, as always, I want to say thank you so much to our longtime subscribers who've been with us since the very beginning. And we've actually, I think, had a few new subscribers to come on. And I want to say thank you. And to the new listeners who are here, make sure to hit subscribe so that you can get notifications and continue to hear us out.
Thank you. And we are doubling up on W.E.B. Du Bois,
Right?
releasing two episodes in 1 week because, like we said in before, that we're going to be taking it chapter by chapter, one
Mm-hmm.
at a time,
Right.
not really rushing this at all. So it necessitates that.
Right. And I really feel as if we're right on time with this for some strange reason because we've
Mhm.
talked about, reading the book, again and to do, episodes and stuff. But now I feel like with everything that's going on, it's like this is right on
Mhm.
time. So yeah.
So yeah,
Hmm.
in our last episode, we discussed the first chapter
Hmm.
in the Souls of Black Folks,
Right.
which
Of our
was of
spiritual
our
striving.
spiritual strivings,
Hmm.
and pretty much it went down as a thesis
Right.
on everything that was going to come after it,
Hmm.
and the main crux was
How
how
does
does
it
it
feel
feel
to
to
be
be a
a
prophet,
problem? Hmm.
and really trying to lay out the black experience and coming to terms with our position
Hmm.
here in America.
Right.
Now, in the second chapter of The Dawn of Freedom,
Oh yeah.
there's this, which is the second essay,
Right.
and this one is about really emancipation
Right.
and how the country had to come to terms with a new citizenry, in a sense.
Fair enough. Right.
So yeah,
Okay.
let's get right into it.
Hmm.
Of the Dawn of Freedom. Careless seems the great avenger, history's lessons but record, one death grapple in the darkness, twixt old systems and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War, and however much they who marched south and north in 1861 may have fixed on the technical points of union and local autonomy as a shibboleth, all nevertheless knew, as we know, that the question of Negro slavery was the real cause of the conflict. Curious it was, too, how this deeper question never forced itself to the surface despite effort and disclaimer. No sooner had Northern armies touched Southern soil than this old question, newly guised, sprang from the earth. What shall be done with Negroes? Peremptory military commands, this way and that, could not answer the query. The Emancipation Proclamation seemed but to broaden and intensify the difficulties, and the war amendments made the Negro problems of today.
He's just pretty much making it plain. Okay, remember that this is published, I want to say, 1903. And even at the and even in this time, there were folk who were trying to rewrite history, you know,
Mhm.
try to make it seem as if, oh, the Civil War wasn't about, slavery, that it was about, state rights or whatever, or
They
whatever.
wanted, like he said, they want to get into the technical
Right,
aspects of the war.
right.
For us, if you want to get into the technical aspects of the
Hmm.
war, it all started about free states and slave
Right.
states, and as America was expanding and
Hmm.
the cultural gulf and the economic gulf was
Hmm.
beginning to broaden between
Right.
the northern and southern states,
Hmm.
because the southern states had slaves,
Right.
the northern states really didn't. And as new states were being incorporated,
Right. They
one
even had to
state,
come in as
yeah, wanted to be
mhm, a free
a
state.
free state, another
And
state
that's,
wanted to be a slave state,
right.
and the dichotomy between these things was based upon the Mason Dixon line and all
Hmm.
these things. But as the divide began to deepen,
Hmm.
the southern states seceded,
Right.
right, which led to the Civil War.
Hmm. That's the
Now,
technical stuff.
at the beginning, Abraham Lincoln didn't explicitly say
Right.
that it was about slavery,
Right.
even though that was the main cause of the war.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't explicitly say that it was
Right.
about slavery, and it was only after prodding by Frederick Douglass
Mm-hmm.
and many of abolitionists at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and also with the because during the Civil War, a lot of Southern uh, produce products
Mm-hmm.
were being embargoed by the
Right.
North,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of European powers did not like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially Britain,
Right. Especially.
especially. And so the British government started to put pressure on the American government
Mm-hmm.
to end the Civil War early or to
Right.
stop the embargo and stuff like that. So it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln that's when he then explicitly made the war
Right.
about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that is what allowed them for the war to continue and not for it to end prematurely. So it
Right.
wasn't until then that
Right.
it explicitly became about slavery,
Mm-hmm.
but that was always the writing on the wall.
Yes.
That was always the most prevalent factor
Right.
in the cause of this war. So like you say, even back in 1903.
Right.
Or,
They're trying to
they were
rewrite
trying to say that I wasn't about
Right.
slavery, trying to recontextualize
Mm-hmm.
what happened then. You know, so like we said, there's nothing new.
Right.
This conversation is not a new one.
That's right.
It is the aim of this essay to study the period of history from 1861 to 1872, so far as it relates to the American Negro. In effect, this tale of the dawn of freedom is an account of that government of men called the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the most singular and interesting of the attempts made by a great nation to grapple with vast problems of race and social condition. The war has naught to do with slaves, cried Congress, the President, and the nation, and yet no sooner had the armies East and West penetrated Virginia and Tennessee than fugitive slaves appeared within their lines. And they came at night, when the flickering campfires shone like vast unsteady stars along the black horizon. Old men and thin with gray and tufted hair, women with frightened eyes dragging whimpering hungry children, men and girls stalwart and gaunt, a horde of starving vagabonds, homeless, helpless, and pitiable in their dark distress. Two methods of treating these newcomers seemed equally logical to opposite sorts of minds. Ben Butler in Virginia quickly declared slave property contraband of war and put the fugitives to work, while Fremont in Missouri declared the slaves free under martial law. Butler's action was approved, but Fremont was hastily countermanded, and his successor, Halleck, saw things differently. Hereafter, he commanded, no slave should be allowed to come into your lines at all. If any come without your knowledge, when owners call for them, deliver them. Such a policy was difficult to enforce. Some of the black refugees declared themselves freemen. Others showed that their masters had deserted them, and still others were captured with forts and plantations. Evidently, too, slaves were a source of strength to the Confederacy and were being used as laborers and producers. They constitute a military resource, wrote Secretary Cameron late in 1861, and being such that they should not be turned over to the enemy is too plain to discuss. So gradually, the tone of the army chiefs changed. Congress forbade the rendition of fugitives, and Butler's contrabands were welcomed as military laborers. This complicated rather than solved the problem, for now the scattering fugitives became a steady stream, which flowed faster as the armies marched. You know, so what he's saying is that even when the country was loath
Mm-hmm.
to explicitly say that this was about slavery, they had to contend
Right.
with black people who were coming as refugees or fugitives of war,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even at the onset, like I said, no sooner than the armies
Right.
marched into Virginia and Tennessee that they had to deal with black people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And many responses varied, like you said, on the person who had to make the decision at
Right.
the time. But it was clear even at the onset of the war that how you treat and how you implement
Mm-hmm.
black people will be the deciding factor in framing this conversation.
Right. So this idea that's been washed through the years about black people serving in the Confederacy, it's been washed to make it seem as if that they supported states' rights and slavery. I'm like that's not
It's patently
that's
untrue.
yeah that's it's a lie, but that new way of thinking now has really has come into play. I would say probably in the last decade or so.
Hmm.
When people are trying to, I guess that's when you've been in a place too long and you're trying to find yourself, and you're like, oh well, my people served in the Confederacy, and not understanding
The
the
context.
context of what that actually meant.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yes. Hmm.
Then the long-headed man with characters of face who sat in the White House saw the inevitable and emancipated the slaves of rebels on New Year's 1863. A month later, Congress called earnestly for the Negro soldiers whom the Act of July 1862 had half grudgingly allowed to enlist. Thus the barriers were leveled, and the deed was done. The stream of fugitives swelled to a flood, and anxious army officers kept inquiring what must be done with slaves, arriving almost daily, or to find food and shelter for women and children. It was a Pierce of Boston who pointed out the way, and thus became, in a sense, the founder of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a firm friend of Secretary Chase, and when in 1861 the care of slaves and abandoned lands devolved upon the Treasury officials, Pierce was specially detailed from the ranks to study the conditions. First he cared for the refugees at Fortress Monroe, and then after Sherman had captured Hilton Head, Pierce was sent there to found his Port Royal experiment of making free working men out of slaves. Before his experiment was barely started, however, the problem of the fugitives had assumed such proportions that it was taken from the hands of the overburdened Treasury Department and given to the army officials. Already, centers of mass freedmen were forming at Fortress Monroe, Washington, New Orleans, Vicksburg, and Corinth, Columbus, Kentucky, and Cairo, Illinois, as well as at Port Royal. Army chaplains found here new and fruitful fields. Superintendents of contraband multiplied, and some attempt at systematic work was made by enlisting the able-bodied men and giving work to the others.
Right. And the Port Royal experiment was a program begun during the American Civil War, in which former slaves successfully worked on the land abandoned by planters.
Hmm.
Okay. In 1861, the Union captured the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and their main harbor, Port Royal. The white residents fled, leaving behind 10,000 black enslaved. Several private Northern charity organizations stepped in to help the former slaves become self sufficient. The result was a model of what Reconstruction could have been. The African Americans demonstrated their ability to work the land efficiently and live independently of white control. They assigned themselves daily tasks for cotton growing and spent their extra time cultivating their own crops, fishing, and hunting. By selling their surplus crops, the locals acquired small amounts of property.
Hmm.
Okay, this happened
So that was the Port Royal
for
experiment,
experiment.
if you want to call it, but it
Hmm.
was more a event
Right,
more than a contrived attempt
right.
at doing anything. It was like I said, the war was coming, and the white residents fled and left all their slaves behind.
Hmm.
And the slaves, with the help of interested parties, like I
Hmm.
said, charity organizations and
Right.
stuff like that, set themselves up
Hmm.
as farmers and planters of their own land,
Right.
and use that to acquire that land,
Hmm.
and show that, and it became something of a motto of what Reconstruction was meant to be,
Right.
as giving them land, and giving them the space
Yeah,
and the
and they're giving them the space and
tools and all the
opportunities.
things
Right.
that they need
Hmm.
to cultivate and become contributing citizens
Right.
of
Now,
America.
and this is in the heat of, you like,
This is during the war.
during the Civil War.
Hmm.
You understand me? And it showed what we pretty much have always known about a people, but particularly since we're talking about us, about black people. Leave us alone, and we'll go about our business. And that's exactly what they did. And then it was, I guess, apparently too successful, because they came in and halted that.
Well,
You know,
it wasn't broadly what you would say, it wasn't broadly implemented.
fair enough, right? That is true. That's
And
that's
pretty
true.
much this chapter here is talking about the failed attempt at
Temps,
trying
right?
to
Implement.
implement
Hmm.
that Port Royal
Right.
experiment.
Hmm.
Then came the Freedmen's Aid Societies, born of the touching appeals from Pierce and from these other centers of distress. There was the American Missionary Association, sprung from the Amistad, and now full grown for work. The various church organizations, the National Freedmen's Relief Association, the American Freedmen's Union, the Western Freedmen's Aid Commission, in all 50 or more active organizations which sent clothes, money, school books, and teachers southward. All they did was needed For the destitution of the freedmen was often reported as too appalling for belief, and the situation was daily growing worse rather than better. And daily, too, it seemed more plain that this was no ordinary matter of temporary relief, but a national crisis. For here loomed a labor problem of vast dimensions. Masses of Negroes stood idle, or if they worked spasmodically, were never sure of pay. And if perchance they received pay, squandered the new thing thoughtlessly. In these and other ways were camp life and the new liberty demoralizing the freedmen. The broader economic organization thus clearly demanded sprang up here and there as accident and local conditions determined. Here it was that Pierce's Port Royal plan of lease plantations and guided workmen pointed out the rough way. In Washington, the military governor, at the urgent appeal of the superintendent, opened confiscated estates to the cultivation of the fugitives, and there in the shadow of the dome gathered black farm villages. General Dix gave over estates to the freedmen of Fortress Monroe, and so on, south and west. The government and benevolent societies furnished the means of cultivation, and the Negro turned again slowly to work. The systems of control thus started rapidly grew here and there into strange little governments, like that of General Banks in Louisiana, with its 90,000 black subjects, its 50,000 guided laborers, and its annual budget of $100,000 and more. It made out 4,000 payrolls a year, registered all freedmen, inquired into grievances and redressed them, laid and collected taxes, and established a system of public schools. So, too, Colonel Eaton, the superintendent of Tennessee and Arkansas, ruled over 100,000 freedmen, leased and cultivated 7,000 acres of cotton land, and fed 10,000 paupers a year. In South Carolina was General Saxton, with his deep interest in black folk. He succeeded Pierce as and the Treasury officials, and sold forfeited estates, leased abandoned plantations, encouraged schools, and received from Sherman, after that terribly picturesque march to the sea, thousands of the wretched camp followers. So once again, like we said before, nothing ever happens in a vacuum.
That's right.
You know, what little success, black people were able to get or garner during Reconstruction, or this is kind of before Reconstruction really became a national thing, but kind of just happening in and of itself, shows that these things were intentional. They didn't just happen.
That's right.
This was people trying to help and people receiving help. This is so it's like black people weren't able to rise out of that destitution through osmosis.
Right.
It didn't happen.
Or magic. Or even happenstance.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It was intentional.
It was intentional. It was a thing that people worked at, white and black, throughout the map to try to create a particular end.
Because we have to understand that the system and the institution of slavery was an intentional act. So therefore, to combat that with, I would say, quote unquote, good at this time, it had to be something that was done intentionally.
You needed a system around it. You needed the infrastructure for it. Black people didn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's not what happened.
Right.
We got help.
Right.
Three characteristic things one might have seen in Sherman's raid through Georgia, which threw the new situation in shadowy relief: the conqueror, the conquered, and the Negro. Some see all significance in the grim front of the destroyer, and some in the bitter sufferers of the lost cause. But to me, neither soldier nor fugitive speaks with so deep a meaning as the dark human cloud that clung like remorse on the rear of those swift columns, swelling at times to half that size, almost engulfing and choking them. In vain were they ordered back. In vain were bridges hewn from beneath their feet. On they trudged and writhed and surged until they rode into Savannah, a starved and naked horde of tens of thousands. There too came the characteristic military remedy. The islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes now made free by act of war. So read the celebrated Field Order Number 15. All these experiments, orders, and systems were bound to attract and perplex the government and the nation. Directly after the Emancipation Proclamation, Representative Eliot had introduced a bill creating a Bureau of Emancipation. but it was never reported. The following June, a committee of inquiry appointed by the Secretary of War reported in favor of a temporary bureau for the improvement, protection, and employment of refugee freedmen on much of the same lines as were afterwards followed. Petitions came in to President Lincoln from distinguished citizens and organizations strongly urging a comprehensive and unified plan of dealing with the freedmen under a bureau which should be charged with the study of plans and execution of measures for easily guiding and in every way judiciously and humanely aiding the passage of our emancipated and yet to be emancipated blacks from the old condition of forced labor to the new state of voluntary industry. Some half-hearted steps were taken to accomplish this, in part by putting the whole matter again in charge of the special Treasury agents. Laws of 1863 and 1864 directed them to take charge of and lease abandoned lands for periods not exceeding 12 months, and to provide in such leases or otherwise for the employment and general welfare of the freedmen. Most of the army officers greeted this as a welcome relief from perplexing Negro affairs, and Secretary Fessenden, July 29, 1864, issued an excellent system of regulations which were afterward closely followed by General Howard. Under Treasury agents, large quantities of land were leased in the Mississippi Valley and many Negroes were employed. But in August 1864, the new regulations were suspended for the reasons of public policy, and the Army was again in control. Meanwhile, Congress had turned its attention to the subject, and in March the House passed a bill by a majority of 2 establishing a Bureau of Freedmen for freedmen in the War Department. Charles Sumner, who had charge of the bill in the Senate, argued that freedmen and abandoned lands ought to be under the same department, and reported a substitute for the House bill attaching the Bureau to the Treasury Department. This bill passed, but too late for action by the House. The debates wandered over the whole policy of the administration and the general question of slavery without touching very closely the specific merits of the measure in hand. Then the national election took place, and the administration, with a vote of renewed confidence from the country, addressed itself to the matter more seriously. A conference between the 2 branches of Congress agreed upon a carefully drawn measure which contained the chief provisions of Sumner's bill, but made the proposed organization a department independent of both the War and Treasury officials. The bill was conservative, giving the new department general superintendence of all freedmen. Its purpose was to establish regulations for them, protect them, lease them land, adjust their wages, and appear in civil and military courts as their next friend. There were many limitations attached to the powers thus granted, and the organization was made permanent. Nevertheless, the Senate defeated the bill, and a new conference committee was appointed. This committee reported a new bill, February 28th, which was whirled through just as the session closed and became the Act of 1865, establishing in the War Department a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So you're just recounting the recounting isn't even over yet.
Right.
Of just even the uphill battle to even create the Bureau. So this is before any official action
Right.
is being done.
Right. Anything officially known as Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Right.
So you see all of the many
the turmoil that's involved.
Attempts at even starting that.
Right.
This last compromise was a hasty bit of legislation, vague and uncertain in outline. A bureau was created to continue during the present war of rebellion and for 1 year thereafter, to which was given the supervision and management of all abandoned lands and the control of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen, under such rules and regulations as may be presented by the head of the bureau and approved by the president. A commissioner appointed by the president and senate was to control the bureau, with an office force not exceeding 10 clerks. The president might also appoint assistant commissioners in the states, and to all these offices military officials might be detailed at regular pay. The Secretary of War could issue rations, clothing, and fuel to the destitute, and all abandoned property was placed in the hands of the Bureau for eventual lease and sale to ex-slaves in 40-acre parcels.
Right, so that's where the 40 acres, come from. A lot of people...
It wasn't hyperbole.
It wasn't hyperbole.
It
wasn't a myth. It was an actual
effort,
an actual thing. And that it was put in writing. To do something of that magnitude. So for all of the naysayers who've been saying that it's a myth and that is not true, you're wrong. You're wrong.
Thus did the United States government definitely assume charge of the emancipated Negro as the ward of the nation. It was a tremendous undertaking. Here at a stroke of the pen was erected a government of millions of men, and not ordinary men either, but black men emasculated by a peculiarly complete system of slavery centuries old. And now suddenly, violently, they come into a new birthright at a time of war and passion in the midst of the stricken and embittered population of their former masters. Any man might well have hesitated to assume charge of such a work with vast responsibilities, indefinite powers, and limited resources. Probably no one but a soldier would have answered such a call promptly, and indeed no one but a soldier could be called, for Congress had appropriated no money for salaries and expenses. Less than a month after the weary emancipator passed to his rest, his successor assigned Major General Oliver O. Howard to duty as commissioner of the new bureau. He was a Maine man, then only 35 years of age. He had marched with Sherman to the sea, had fought well at Gettysburg, and but the year before had been assigned to the command of the Department of Tennessee. An honest man with too much faith in human nature, little aptitude for business and intricate detail, he had had large opportunity of becoming acquainted at first hand with much of the work before him. And of that it has been truly said that no approximately correct history of civilization can ever be written which does not throw out in bold relief, as one of the great landmarks of political and social progress, the organization and administration of the Freedmen's Bureau.
It was a bold attempt.
Yes.
Definitely.
So now at this point, it has been established.
Right.
And there is a commissioner,
Mm-hmm.
General Oliver O. Howard,
Mm-hmm.
a war veteran who has been put in charge of this giant, at this point, hitherto unforeseen, relief effort for black people.
Right. He's a young man too.
Mm-hmm.
He's young, maybe a little bit, in over his head, very idealistic, but still, this was the bold effort that is now established to repair, what has transpired, in regards
over
to
the centuries,
over the centuries,
and I guess more explicitly,
right,
the after effects of the Civil War.
War.
On May 12, 1865, Howard was appointed, and he assumed the duties of his office promptly on the 15th and began examining the field of work. A curious mess he looked upon: little despotism, communistic experiment, slavery, peonage, business speculations, organized charity, unorganized almsgiving, all reeling on under the guise of helping the freedmen, and all enshrined in the smoke and blood of war and cursing and silence of angry men. On May 19th, the new government, for a government it really was, issued its constitution. Commissioners were to be appointed in each of the seceded states, who were to take charge of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen. And all relief and rations were to be given by their consent alone. The Bureau invited continued cooperation with benevolent societies and declared it will be the object of all commissioners to introduce practicable systems of compensated labor and to establish schools. Forthwith 9 assistant commissioners were appointed. They were to hasten to their field work, see gradually to close relief establishments, and make the destitute self-supporting, act as courts of law where there were no courts, or where Negroes were not recognized in them as free, establish the institution of marriage among ex-slaves and keep records, see that freedmen were free to choose their employer, and help in making fair contracts for them. And finally, the circular said, simple good faith for which we hope on all hands for those concerned in the passing away of slavery will especially relieve the assistant commissioners in the discharge of their duties toward the freedmen as well as promote the general welfare.
Right. So this was an intentional step to move the former enslaved who are now refugees to make them, I'll say,
citizens.
Citizens in the way that you make people citizens and making them whole. And it was an intentional, guided step.
Like I said, this was a new governmental body.
Right.
Meant to adjudicate the creation of this new citizenship.
That's right.
For black people. and its constitution was given,
Right.
right, and it had a constitution. Like
Right.
this was a new governmental body,
Right.
and it
It
was,
did.
like you said, created in the
Mm-hmm.
wake of war,
Mm-hmm.
of bitterness,
Mm-hmm.
from both within and without.
Without. Mm-hmm.
So it was a gargantuan undertaking. Yeah, created at the most inopportune time for us, but it was no other time for it to be created. It was created really at the only time you could say it could have been created. It got through only at the time it could have gotten through at.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you could think, because you can say that this type of action is necessary now,
Correct.
and with
Mm-hmm.
with the destitute and squalor that we currently find ourselves in,
Mm-hmm.
that there needs to be a organization
And it needs to be direct.
created
It needs to be bold, and it
for
needs
the
to be intentional.
intentional,
Right.
for the intentional repairment and uplifting of many of the poor living in our communities today,
Mm-hmm.
right? But looking at it, it seems impossible
Mm-hmm.
now for something like that to even get created. So, at the most inopportune time
Right.
was then the only time
Mm-hmm.
that something like this could have been attempted.
Right.
At the time where it was most likely to fail, as we're going to go into
Right.
deeper later on.
Mm-hmm.
No sooner was the work thus started, and the general system and local organizations in some measure begun, that two grave difficulties appeared which changed largely the theory and outcome of Bureau work. First, there were the abandoned lands of the South. It had long been the more or less definitely expressed theory of the North that all the chief problems of emancipation might be settled by establishing the slaves on the forfeited lands of their masters. A sort of poetic justice, said some. But this poetry done into solemn prose meant either wholesale confiscation of private property in the South or vast appropriation. Now Congress had not appropriated a cent, and no sooner did the proclamation of general amnesty appear than the 800,000 acres of abandoned lands in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau melted quickly away. The second difficulty lay in perfecting the local organization of the Bureau throughout the wide field of work. Making a new machine and sending out officials of duly ascertained fitness for a great work of social reform is no child's task. But this task was even harder, for a new central organization had to be fitted on a heterogeneous and confused but already existing system of relief and control of ex-slaves. And the agents available for this work must be sought for in an army still busy with war operations, men in the very nature of the case ill fitted for delicate social work, or among the questionable camp of followers of an invading host. Thus, after a year's work, vigorously as it was pushed, the problem looked even more difficult to grasp and solve than at the beginning. Nevertheless, three things that year's work did, well worth the doing. It relieved a vast amount of physical suffering. It transported 7,000 fugitives from congested centers back to the farm, and best of all, it inaugurated the crusade of the New England School, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
It put people to school.
Yep. Okay. And just think about it, because like we talked about this. Had they just left this in the hands of the folk who were already there, you have folk coming in from. All right, there's still a war going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is there was still a war going on. So you have people being pulled from, I'm gonna say, the actual war front. You have people being pulled, from the north, right? And they're coming in and setting up their organizations and their schools, different things of that nature. And of course, you have these tens of thousands of black people
Mm-hmm.
who are there,
Who are aimless,
who are aimless, like,
shell shocked.
yes,
Like I said, just kind
the
of
trauma
forced,
of this, right?
forced into this new birthright.
Right. And it was forced in this new birth violently, the same way,
The
the same,
force,
yeah,
our slavery was imposed violently, and now
right.
our freedom
Freedom, that's right, quote unquote, right,
seems to be imposed violently.
violently. And so we see that it's a like you say, a huge and enormous event, and all of these things are interplaying, and they're all connected, and it is intentional work.
Hmm. So yeah.
Yeah.
The annals of this Ninth Crusade are yet to be written. The tale of a mission that seemed to our age far more quixotic than the quest of St. Louis seemed to his. Behind the midst of ruin and rapine waved the calico dresses of women who dared, and after the hoarse mouthings of the field guns rang the rhythm of the alphabet. Rich and poor they were, serious and curious, bereaved now of a father, now of a brother, now of more than these. They came seeking a life work in planting. New England schoolhouses among the white and black of the South. They did their work well. In that first year, they taught 100,000 souls and more. Evidently, Congress must soon legislate again on the hastily organized Bureau, which has so quickly grown into wide significance and vast possibilities. An institution such as that was well nigh as difficult to end as to begin. Early in 1866, Congress took up the matter when Senator Trumbull of Illinois introduced a bill to extend the Bureau and enlarge its powers.
Hmm.
This measure received at the hands of Congress far more thorough discussion and attention than its predecessor. The war cloud had thinned enough to allow a clearer conception of the work of emancipation. The champions of the bill argue that the strengthening of the Freedmen's Bureau was still a military necessity, that it was needed for the proper carrying out of the 13th Amendment, and was a work of sheer justice to the ex slave, at a trifling cost to the government. The opponents of the measure declared that the war was over, and the necessity for war measures passed, that the Bureau, by reason of its extraordinary powers, was clearly unconstitutional in time of peace, and was destined to irritate the South and pauperize the freedmen at a final cost of possibly hundreds of millions. These two arguments were unanswered, and indeed unanswerable.
Hmm.
The one that the extraordinary powers of the Bureau threatened the civil rights of all citizens, and the other that the government must have power to do what manifestly must be done, and that present abandonment of the freedmen meant their practical re-enslavement. The bill which finally passed enlarged and made permanent the Freedmen's Bureau. It was promptly vetoed by President Johnson as unconstitutional, unnecessary, and extrajudicial, and failed of passage over the veto. Meantime, however, the breach between Congress and the President began to broaden, and a modified form of the lost bill was finally passed over the President's second veto, July 16th.
Now just remember, it's sort of like the same, like we mentioned, like it's sort of the same thing that's happening now, right? Why do we need, these voter protection laws? Why do we need these voting rights? I mean, we've already had, you know, we elected a black president. We have a black, you know, vice president. We have this, we have that. So why do we need all of these protections? So it's the same type of argument that was made back in the late
And
1860s.
even then,
Hmm.
like I said, the Freedmen's Bureau was a new governmental body.
Right.
And in this, time, given the authority and power that it needed
Right.
to, facilitate the type of change it was looking for, it would have been a challenge to the regular government.
That's right.
It would
Correct.
have been an entire restructuring of what the government was. And that is the real conversation
Hmm.
here. Like I've said many times before, that a government always has to choose between
Right.
itself and its people,
Right.
and it always chooses itself.
Hmm.
You have to look, and you can look back in history and see that the way the government is now. I mean, during this time,
Right.
right? The way the Constitution was ratified, in and of itself, was unconstitutional,
Right.
but it was a necessary step that was needed to take for the formation of the country,
Hmm.
right? For it to be established as a central unified power.
Right.
It needed a central unifying document, right? And to do that, like you could go over the ratification
Hmm.
of the Constitution and see all of the steps,
Yes.
legal and illegal,
Legal,
that were
right.
taken in doing that.
That's right.
This is one of those same moments.
Right.
Like yes, it is unconstitutional to give any one body the amount of power that is
Right.
necessary to do this type of change,
Hmm.
right? It is unconstitutional. Well, something has to give. Either
Right.
the organization has to change, or what is deemed constitutional, or the Constitution, or the governmental body as a whole has to change.
Yeah.
This was the work that needed to be done. It
Mhm.
wasn't about, emancipation wasn't just about giving black people land and a
Right.
job.
Mhm.
It was about a restructuring of the entire national impetus,
That's right.
of the entire cultural basis in which the country was founded on. it needed a complete rehaul.
Right.
Everything, society
Mm-hmm.
needed a reboot.
Yep.
But it wanted to have this cake and eat it too. It wanted to just take so much and have so much, but not truly forfeit on the things that gave the government its power.
Right. I mean, you can even think
That
about
gave
now,
the
like
society its
like
strength.
why we always ask, like, why is it so difficult for folks, just to do
the right thing.
to do the right thing? Well, here it is. This is why.
Mm-hmm.
Because
you're not just challenging that issue.
right.
You're challenging the whole structure,
the whole structure, the whole
in
system.
which it's existing in. So, and if it gives just a little,
Right.
the whole thing might falter. It's the domino
Right.
effect that led to all the proxy wars
Mhm.
in the 1980s. If you give communism just a little ground,
Right.
the whole thing might fall. But it's the same mentality here. If you do the right thing right here,
Right.
then who knows
Yeah.
what was going to happen
Yes.
next.
I mean, just like I said, just a thought, and I mentioned, if we just go off just the basic numbers, right?
Mhm.
You're talking hundreds of thousands of black people, right?
Mhm.
And they're gonna be located in what amounts to about 8 to 10 states. But I always say, well, we'll just go with 8. Well, what does that mean? At least 8 black governors every 4 years for I don't know how long, right?
Mhm.
You're talking at minimum 16 black senators. And I mentioned, could you imagine today if there was 16 black senators right now in the Senate? Could you imagine? Like that what that means? And so,
But like we said, we don't know if that's how it would have shaped out.
right, we don't know, but
the thing is, that was an implication.
Yes,
that was a
exactly.
possibility.
That was the
On
possibility.
That alone, on
Right.
that alone, it was seen as a challenge
Right.
to the status quo.
Exactly.
The Act of 1866 gave the Freedmen's Bureau its final form, the form by which it will be known to posterity and judged of men. It extended the existence of the Bureau to July 1868. It authorized additional assistant commissioners, the retention of army officers mustered out of regular service, the sale of certain forfeited lands to freedmen on nominal terms, the sale of Confederate public property for Negro schools, and a wider field of judicial interpretation and cognizance. The government of the unreconstructed South was thus put very largely in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau, especially as in many cases the departmental military commander was now made also assistant commissioner. It was thus that the Freedmen's Bureau became a full-fledged government of men. It made laws, executed them, and interpreted them. It laid and collected taxes, defined and punished crime, maintained and used military force, and dictated such measures as it thought necessary and proper for the accomplishment of its varied ends. Naturally, all these powers were not exercised continuously nor to their fullest extent. And yet, as General Howard has said, scarcely any subject that has to be legislated upon in civil society failed, at one time or another, to demand the action of this singular bureau.
Yeah. The Bureau was acting,
It
was conducting
everywhere.
itself, like a
And
government.
it was functionally the government.
The government.
For millions of people. And
Mhm.
like you said, for the entirety of the South, it
Mhm.
was the prevalent governmental body
Mhm.
that adjudicated action down there.
Mhm.
To understand and criticize intelligently so vast a work, one must not forget an instant the drift of things in the later 60s. Lee had surrendered, Lincoln was dead, and Johnson and Congress were at a loggerheads. The 13th Amendment was adopted, the 14th pending, and the 15th declared enforced in 1870. Guerrilla raiding, the ever-present flickering afterflame of war, was spending its force against the Negroes, and all the Southern land was awakening as from some wild dream to poverty and social revolution. In a time of perfect calm, amid willing neighbors and streaming wealth, the social uplifting of 4 million slaves to an assured and self-sustaining place in the body, politic, and economic would have been a Herculean task. But when to the inherent difficulties of so delicate and nice a social operation were aided the spite and hate of conflict, the hell of war, when suspicion and cruelty were rife and gaunt hunger went beside bereavement, in such a case, the work of any instrument of social regeneration was in large part foredoomed to failure. The very name of the Bureau stood for a thing in the South which for 2 centuries and better men had refused even to argue. That a life amid free Negroes was simply unthinkable, the maddest of experiments.
And I always continue with, because they were black. Remember, that was the thing that W.E.B. Du Bois had established early on. Is that
at the very first,
at the very beginning, is that
The crux of the issue
issue,
is not
right?
that you are uneducated
Educated, or that you were a
or that
slave,
you
right?
are, less and all that. The
Mm-hmm.
crux of the issue
Issue,
is that you are black.
black.
You are the other. You are
Mm-hmm.
meant to occupy a very particular
Particular. That's
space
right.
in the maintenance of the society. The
Mm-hmm.
fact now that you are trying to spread out or get out of that is more than a social cause.
Mm-hmm.
It is a mental, societal, infraction.
Yes.
It is
Yes.
something. It is like a pig growing wings.
Right.
It is impossible by the nature of the thing, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that this impossibility is happening represented a cognitive dissonance,
Dissonance. And
a
remember,
melting of
right.
a
And
perceptual
so
basis that existed for
at
so
this
long.
time, this is the time when you have your 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, right? So your 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. Your 14th Amendment, it addresses citizen rights and equal protection of the laws. And of course, you have your 15th Amendment, which prohibits discrimination in voting rights of citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So you have those amendments being crafted at a time when folk are like, there is no way
of mental hardship,
yep.
of it was crafted, like I said, it was done, it can only have been done at this time,
right.
at the most unopportune of times.
Mm-hmm.
Like he said, the country could have been, in the green. Everything could have been perfect.
Right.
And it could not have happened in this guise, and it still would have been a Herculean task. But in this environment,
mm-hmm.
doing this, like I said, it was as if a whole section of the nation was waking from a dream.
Right.
It was this wild, hot,
mm-hmm.
time with raids and
right.
bereavement and hunger and death and war
right.
was still a very prevalent factor in
right.
these things.
Because you have to
in this atmosphere,
in this atmosphere
for
of
this
right.
bureau to succeed is impossible.
Right, because you have to understand like the tenor of the people who they are even dealing with. Right, you have to, what even these people were just. They were my slaves 2 weeks ago. I owned them.
Like he said,
that life so now,
amid free
right.
Negroes was simply unthinkable.
That's right.
The maddest of experiments.
That's right.
It was an impossibility
mm-hmm.
based on the like I said, on a cultural basis, a perceptual basis that has existed for literally centuries. For centuries, it is what the country was founded upon.
Mm-hmm.
You can say that it was founded upon freedom. It was founded upon the freedom of particular people and the enslavement of a particular people. That's what this country was founded on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And in the matter of just a few years,
right.
a few months really all of this started to take place. Mm-hmm. Now you have, like I said, the creation of this whole new citizenry,
right.
this whole new thing, trying to create a place for that. In the most inopportune of atmospheres, where the country had before it even come to grips with the idea of this even being a possibility.
Right.
Like we had to exist, like in the South, mm-hmm. in the farmlands, where we had the greatest opportunity to be put to work, to mm-hmm. have that opportunity. In that atmosphere,
right.
It was completely unthinkable, and it was impossible.
Right.
And we see.
Yes.
Exactly. He's going to detail,
right.
Why it failed.
Mm-hmm.
The agents of that bureau could command varied all the way from unselfish philanthropists to narrow-minded busybodies and thieves. And even though it be true that the average was far better than the worst, it was the occasional fly that helped spoil the ointment. Then amid all crouched the freed slave, bewildered between friend and foe. He had emerged from slavery, not the worst slavery in the world, not a slavery that made all life unbearable, rather a slavery that had here and there something of kindliness and fidelity and happiness. But with all slavery, which so far as human aspiration and desert were concerned, classed the black man and the ox together. And the Negro knew full well that whatever their deeper convictions may have been, Southern men had fought with desperate energy to perpetuate this slavery under which the black masses, with half-articulate thought, had writhed and shivered. They welcomed freedom with a cry. Mm-hmm. They shrank from the master who still strove for their chains. They fled to the friends that had freed them, even though those friends stood ready to use them as a club for driving the recalcitrant South back into loyalty. So the cleft between the white and black South grew. Idle to say it never should have been. It was as inevitable as its results were pitiable. Curiously, incongruous elements were left arrayed against each other. The North, the government, the carpetbagger, and the slave. Here and there, all the South that was white, whether gentleman or vagabond, honest man or rascal, lawless murderer or martyr to duty. Thus, it is doubly difficult to write of this period calmly. So intense was the feeling, so mighty the human passions that swayed and blinded men. Amid it all, two figures ever stand to typify that day to coming ages. The one, a gray haired gentleman whose fathers had quit themselves like men, whose sons lay in nameless graves, who bowed to the evil of slavery because its abolition threatened untold ill to all, who stood at last in the evening of life, a blighted, ruined form with hate in his eyes. And the other, a form hovering dark and mother-like, her awful face black with the mist of centuries, and aforetime quailed at that white mass's command, had bent in love over the cradles of his sons and daughters, and closed in death the sunken eyes of his wife. Too, at his behest, had laid herself low to his lust, and borne a tawny man-child to the world, only to see her dark boy's limbs scattered to the wind by midnight marauders riding after cursed niggers. These were the saddest sights of that woeful day, and no man clasped the hands of these two passing figures of the present past, but hating, they went to their long home, and hating their children's children, live today. Mm-hmm. Like it was, this, like I said, this was a mental epidemic. These were people, like I said, you didn't have to like slavery or so be or believe that, you know, that black people actually were animals to take part in this system.
Right.
For more people, they were like the more is that they were so used to this idea, so used to this system that anything outside of it required too much of them.
Right.
You know, too much of them. They were a part of slavery mainly because that was done. It doesn't matter if it was right or wrong. That's how it was.
Right.
And anything outside of that was unthinkable. You know, and for black people,
right? It sounds familiar.
You know,
that's what
but
we're
for
dealing
black
with now,
people,
right?
you know, it was that like you said, you know, your children were raised by us. We huddled over your cradles. We buried your dead. And through it all, we were beaten, we were raped, and we were forced to mother, like they said, this man child.
Right.
This, you know, Quasimodo, this half-formed human, still trying to find itself. And on all ends, being subject to the hatred of your honorable men and of your, you know, vagabonds.
Right.
All of it
All
falling
of it.
back onto us again. The specter of this battle, this war that has not and will not end until more substantial steps are taken to create something a bit more wholesome. But in that environment of these two polar extremes of mental, you know, destitution, of people who could not conceive of themselves in the other's eyes, it made it impossible. And it showed that, like he said, that the work that needed to be done was not the work of creating an infrastructure, but it was the work of creating that space mentally in both black and white people of being able to recognize each other as a people, as victims of a broken system. But everyone was in too much pain. Everybody was in their own way.
That's right.
You know, and like we said, it's not like you have no cause to be. You know, it's not like you have no cause to be. A way of life was destroyed here before people came to the mental maturity to end it. It was never ended because it was wrong, not even by the North.
Yep.
It was ended because it was working too well. And not everybody was able to profit off of it.
That's right.
That's why it was ended. You know, it didn't come to an end because the people came to the conclusion that this should not be done.
That's right.
And if it didn't, and then we would still be, well, we are still, there's still slavery going on, but America would still have people in chains.
Chains, right.
The only way it could have ended is through blood. Right? Whether it was a massive slave revolt that just couldn't be stopped or a civil war. it was not going to come because we came to a mutual understanding
Understanding.
of one another.
Hmm.
But that's the only way this was going to properly be able to come to an end.
Hmm.
That was the work that needed to be undertaken.
Right.
But that's not the work that was undertaken.
Right.
It was the creation
Building
of
the
infrastructure.
infrastructure and doing those things,
It was a part of
it
it.
was a part of it.
But that's
But
not
the
its main
mind didn't
goal.
change.
Yeah.
The minds, you like to say the hearts and minds of folk of the people did not change. So like he mentioned, it's complete utter madness
Hmm.
for this black person now to be seen, you know,
As an equal.
as an equal.
Hmm.
It's utter madness.
And it's out of madness to see these white people as friends.
Oh yeah, definitely madness. That's how
It's
that's
impossible
possible.
at this time.
Hmm.
You can say even now.
Yeah, yeah.
But it
Correct.
is the necessary work.
Hmm.
Here, then, was the field of work for the Freedmen's Bureau, and since, with some hesitation, it was continued by the Act of 1868 until 1869, let us look upon 4 years of its work as a whole. There were in 1868 900 bureaus officials scattered from Washington to Texas, ruling directly and indirectly many millions of men. The deeds of these rulers fall mainly under seven heads: the relief of physical suffering, the overseeing of the beginnings of free labor, the buying and selling of land, the establishment of schools, the paying of bounties, the administration of justice, and the financiering of all these activities. Up to June
69.
1869, over half a million patients had been treated by Bureau physicians and surgeons, and 60 hospitals and asylums had been in operation. In 50 months, 21 million free rations were distributed at a cost of over $4 million. Next came the difficult question of labor. First, 30,000 black men were transported from the refuges and relief stations back to the farms, back to the critical trial of a new way of working. Plain instructions went out from Washington. The laborers must be free to choose their employers. No fixed rate of wages was prescribed, and there was to be no peonage or forced labor. So far, so good. But where local ages differed, Toto Calio, is that how you say that?
Yeah.
In capacity and character, where the personnel was continually changing. The outcome was necessarily varied. The largest element of success lay in the fact that the majority of the freedmen were willing, even eager to work. So labor contracts were written, 50,000 in a single state, laborers advised, wages guaranteed, and employers supplied. In truth, the organization became a vast labor bureau. Not perfect, indeed, notably defective here and there, but on the whole successful beyond the dream of thoughtful men. The two great obstacles which confronted the officials were the tyrant and the idler, the slaveholder who was determined to perpetuate slavery under another name, and the freedman who regarded freedom as perpetual rest, the devil and the deep sea. In the work of establishing the Negroes as peasant proprietors, the Bureau was from the first handicapped and at last absolutely checked. Something was done, and larger things were planned. Abandoned lands were leased so long as they remained in the hands of the Bureau, and a total revenue of nearly $500,000 derived from black tenants. Some other lands to which the nation had gained little were sold on easy terms, and public lands were opened for settlement to the very few freedmen who had tools and capital. But the vision of 40 acres and a mule, the righteous and reasonable ambition to become a landholder, which the nation had all but categorically promised the freedmen, was destined in most cases to bitter disappointment. And those men of marvelous hindsight who are today seeking to preach the Negro back to the present peonage of the soil know well, or ought to know, that the opportunity of binding the Negro peasant willingly to the soil was lost on the day when the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau had to go to South Carolina and tell the weeping freedmen, after their years of toil, that their land was not theirs, and there was a mistake somewhere. If by 1874 the Georgia Negro alone owned 350,000 acres of land, it was by grace of his thrift rather than by bounty of the government.
That's right. So this you know, we've been had. Okay, you tell us to do this. We were promised a particular.
Hmm.
We were promised something, and then you're like,
We worked. You made a profit, like you said.
"That's right,"
You know,
and we were
nearly
denied.
$500,000
That's right.
derived from black tenants.
That's right. and we were denied our titles.
Mm-hmm.
We were denied the land that was supposed to have been ours. And so this idea of, you know, building black wealth and owning land, you can't tell it the folk who've just been denied it.
Yeah, we've been doing that.
We've been doing this already.
Literally, that was the first idea.
That was the first thing.
First thing we did.
And so now you want to come, and talk about in your compromise,
Mm-hmm.
About buying land and owning land. We've done this already. We've done this. We've been had.
Not to mention that we shouldn't have to buy
Anything.
We shouldn't have to buy the land that was promised to us to
begin with. That was, not only was it promised, you pretty much wrote it down about the 40 acres. That was written. It wasn't like
It wasn't some thing that
something we came up with.
You came up
with.
That was your end of the bargain that you were meant to keep up on.
Right. And you wrote it, and then you were like, well, there was a mistake somewhere. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. And now you want to come to me because I remember this compromise. Mm-hmm. I want to say, I think it was first like in the 1895 or so. Now keep in mind, Reconstruction, this keep talking about from 1861 to 1872. Mm-hmm. So you come to me, this is like almost 1870. So you're telling me, 20-something years later about buying land, owning land, and control this. What? There were folk who heard what Washington said, and they were the same people whose lands was confiscated from them. Mm-hmm. And you're telling me no. So yeah. Go ahead.
The great success of the Freedmen's Bureau lay in the planting of the free school among Negroes and the idea of free elementary education among all classes in the South. Not only called the school mistress through the benevolent agencies and built them schoolhouses, but it helped discover and support such apostles of human culture as Edmund Ware, Samuel Armstrong, and Erastus Cravath. The opposition to Negro education in the South was at first bitter, and showed itself in ashes, insult, and blood, for the South believed an educated Negro to be a dangerous Negro. And the South was not wholly wrong, for education among all kinds of men always has had and always will have an element of danger and revolution, of dissatisfaction and discontent. Nevertheless, men strive to know. Perhaps some inkling of this paradox, even in the unquiet days of the Bureau, helped the bayonets alive, and opposition to human training will still today lie smoldering in the South, but not flaming. Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, and Hampton were founded in these days, and $6 million were expended for educational work, $750,000 of which the freedmen themselves gave of their poverty. Such contributions, together with the buying of land and various other enterprises, show that the ex-slave was handling some free capital already. The chief initial source of this labor in the army was labor in the army and his pay and bounty as a soldier. Payments to Negro soldiers were at first complicated by the ignorance of the recipients, and the fact that the quotas of colored regiments from northern states were largely filled by recruits from the South, unknown to their fellow soldiers. Consequently, payments were accompanied by such frauds that Congress, by joint resolution in 1867, put the whole matter in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau. In 2 years, $6 million was thus distributed to 5,000 claimants, and in the end the sum exceeded $8 million. Even in this system, fraud was frequent, but still the work put needed capital in the hands of practical paupers, and some, at least, was well spent. The most perplexing and least successful part of the Bureau's work lay in the exercise of its judicial functions. The regular Bureau court consisted of one representative of the employer, one of the Negro, and one of the Bureau. If the Bureau could have maintained a perfectly judicial attitude, this arrangement would have been ideal, and must in time have gained confidence. But the nature of its other activities and the character of its personnel prejudiced the Bureau in favor of the black litigants, and led without doubt to much injustice and annoyance.
So just to stop right there for a moment. So basically what's happening here is that, there may have been some particular claim or whatever the case may be, and apparently
the Bureau was most likely to find on the side of black people.
And so,
to the annoyance of
white folks. And so,
the employer.
Yeah, and so apparently that's a problem. Mm-hmm. That's a problem.
On the other hand, to leave the Negro in the hands of Southern courts was impossible. In a distracted land where slavery had hardly fallen, to keep the strong from wanton abuse of the weak, and the weak from gloating insolently over the half-shorn strength of the strong, was a thankless, hopeless task. The former masters of the land were peremptorily ordered about, seized and imprisoned, and punished over and again with scant courtesy from army officers. The former slaves were intimidated, beaten, raped, and butchered by angry and revengeful men. Bureau courts tended to become centers simply for punishing whites, while the regular civil courts tended to become solely institutions for perpetuating the slavery of blacks. Almost every law and method ingenuity could devise was employed by the legislatures to reduce the Negroes to serfdom, to make them the slaves of the state, if not of individual owners, while the Bureau officials too often were found striving to put the bottom rail on top and give the freed men a power and independence which they could not yet use. It is all well enough for us of another generation to wax wise with advice to those who bore the burden in the heat of the day. It is full easy now to see that the man who lost home, fortune, and family at a stroke and saw his land ruled by mules and niggers was really benefited by the passing of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
It is not difficult now to say that the young freed man, cheated and cuffed about, who had seen his father's head beaten to a jelly and his own mother namelessly assaulted, that the meek shall inherit the earth. Above all, nothing is more convenient than to heap on the Freedmen's Bureau all the evils of that evil day, and damn it utterly for every mistake and blunder that was made.
Word.
It's hard to see each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say that to a black man that your due is coming when you are being beaten and raped.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to tell the white man that this is necessary
Mm-hmm.
when your land is now being occupied by mules and niggers.
Right.
You know, it's hard for there to be a real consensus, a real melding of minds
Mm-hmm.
during this atmosphere. And like you said, it's easy to lump it all on the Freedmen's Bureau. I guess even in his day,
Right.
to lump it all on the Freedmen's Bureau when it really was a victim of the times. All this is easy, but it is neither sensible nor just.
Right.
Someone had blundered, but that was long before Oliver Harwood was born. There was criminal aggression and heedless neglect, but without some system of control, there would have been far more than there was. Had that control been from within, the Negro would have been re-enslaved to all intents and purposes. Coming, as the control did from without, perfect men and methods would have bettered all things, and even with imperfect agents and questionable methods, the work accomplished was not undeserving of commendation. Such was the dawn of freedom. Such was the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, which, summed up in brief, may be epitomized thus. For some $15 million beside the sum spent before 1865 in the dole of benevolent societies, this Bureau set going a system of free labor, established a beginning of peasant proprietorship, secured the recognition of black freedmen before courts of law, and founded the Free Common School in the South. On the other hand, it failed to begin the establishment of goodwill between ex-masters and freedmen,
Mm-hmm.
to guard its work wholly from paternalistic methods which discourage self-reliance, and to carry out to a considerable extent its implied promise to furnish the freedmen with land. Its successes were the result of hard work supplemented by the aid of philanthropists and the eager strivings of black men. Its failures were the result of bad local agents, the inherent difficulties of the work, and national neglect. Such an institution, from its wide powers, great responsibilities, large control of monies, and generally conspicuous position, was naturally open to repeated and bitter attack. It sustained a searching congressional investigation at the instance of Fernando Wood in 1870. Its archives and few remaining functions were with blunt discourtesy transferred from House control in his absence to the supervision of Secretary of War Belknap in 1872. On the Secretary's recommendation, finally, the consequence of grave intimation of wrongdoing made by the Secretary and his subordinates, General Howard was court-martialed in 1874. In both of these trials, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was officially exonerated from any willful misdoings and his work commended. Nevertheless, many unpleasant things were brought to light. The methods of transacting the business of the Bureau were faulty. Several cases of defalcation were proved, and other frauds strongly suspected. There were some business transactions which savored of dangerous speculation, if not dishonesty, and around it all, with the smirch of the Freedmen's Bank. So it was pretty much what was going on in the 2008
Right.
mortgage bust,
Mm-hmm.
where they were defrauding people and
Mm-hmm.
overinflating the value of certain lands and
Lands,
stuff,
right.
and telling people to invest and do all this.
Yeah, put your
And
money in
then
the bank and stuff like that.
and then it all fell apart.
Right. And we know that, for the most part, the Freedmen's Bank were black clientele.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, they put their money in the bank, and it's probably one of the greatest heist, especially, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you know. Yes.
It all it was falling apart
Mm-hmm.
faster than it could be put together, and what little it was able to accomplish should be commended.
Right.
In W.E.B. Du Bois's mind,
Mm-hmm.
and it did accomplish some substantial, critical things.
Mm-hmm.
But like he said, it failed at doing the work that it really needed to do. It didn't mend the divide, and it did not give the freedmen the land that they said they were going to get.
Mm-hmm.
Morally and practically, the Freedmen's Bank was part of the Freedmen's Bureau, although it had no legal connection with it. With the prestige of the government back of it, and a directing board of unusual respectability and national reputation, this banking institution had made a remarkable start in development of that thrift among black folk which slavery had kept them from knowing. Then in one sad day came the crash. All the hard-earned dollars of the freedmen disappeared, but that was the least of the loss. All the faith in saving went too, and much of the faith in men. And that was a loss at a nation which today sneers at Negro shiftlessness has never yet made good. Not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the serious savings banks chartered by the nation for their especial aid. Where all the blame should rest, it is hard to say whether the Bureau and the bank died chiefly by reason of the blows of its selfish friends or the dark machinations of its foes. Perhaps even time will never reveal, for here lies unwritten history.
Correct. And keeping in mind, this is white people. Even now, we have a hard time, trusting banks, getting mortgages, because of because of that history there.
And you can see the same thing today. You can look at
Right.
When Haiti had those earthquakes,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was
All
this
billions of dollars, right,
of relief that was given to all these different charities and organizations that were meant to go into Haiti
right,
and
build
fix
and rebuild,
and all that stuff.
Right.
But all that money seemed to have just disappeared into the hands of these organizations,
right,
and all these philanderos, like he said, of unusual respectability and national reputation.
Mm-hmm.
All these.
Go on and say it.
I was about to say something else.
Right.
But all these parasites,
right,
who just came and leached as much profit as they possibly can from this tragedy.
Right.
And then when it all fell apart, there was nothing left for the people who actually needed it.
Sounds familiar.
Of the foes without the Bureau, the bitterest were those who attacked not so much its conduct or policy under the law as the necessity for any such institution at all. Such attacks came primarily from the border states and the South, and they were summed up by Senator Davis of Kentucky when he moved to entitle the Act of 1866 a bill to promote strife and conflict between the white and black races by a grant of unconstitutional power. The argument gathered tremendous strength South and North, but its very strength was its weakness. For argued the plain common sense of the nation, if it is unconstitutional, unpractical, and futile for the nation to stand guardian over its helpless wards, then there is left but one alternative: to make those wards their own guardians by arming them with the ballot. Moreover, the path of the practical politician pointed the same way. For argued this opportunist, if we cannot peacefully reconstruct the South with white votes, we certainly can with black votes. So justice and force join hands.
Sounds familiar.
Like I said, if it's unconstitutional
right,
to place so much power in one governmental body meant to oversee all of this, then put that power in the hands of the black people.
Right.
If
and let them vote, right.
If you can't build the peace on white votes, you sure as hell can do it on black votes.
But
you don't want to do that.
Yeah. You don't want to give.
You don't want to do that. Then.
Right.
You just want to do nothing.
Right.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
You can see it out today.
Yeah.
Like instead of the Republican Party actually changing its beliefs and trying to create something constructive for people, let's just try to get them to not vote.
Yeah.
Let's just do
Let's just
all
suppress it, right?
let's just suppress. Let's just do all this stuff. Like so, once again,
Here we are.
here we are. The alternative thus offered the nation was not between full and restricted Negro suffrage, else every sensible man, black and white, would easily have chosen the latter. It was rather a choice between suffrage and slavery. After endless blood and gold had flowed to sweep human bondage away, not a single Southern legislature stood ready to admit a Negro under any conditions to the polls. Not a single Southern legislature believed free Negro labor was possible without a system of restrictions that took all its freedom away. There was scarcely a white man in the South who did not honestly regard emancipation as a crime and its practical nullification as a duty. In such a situation, the granting of the ballot to the black man was a necessity, the very least a guilty nation could grant a wronged race, and the only method of compelling the South to accept the results of the war. Thus, Negro suffrage ended a civil war by beginning a race feud, and some felt gratitude toward the race thus sacrificed in its swaddling cloths on the altar of national integrity, and some felt and feel only indifference and contempt.
Keep on. I mean,
had political exigencies been less pressing, the opposition to governmental guardianship of Negroes less bitter, and the attachment to slave system less strong, the social seer can well imagine a far better policy. A permanent Freedmen's Bureau with a national system of Negro schools, a carefully supervised employment and labor office, a system of impartial protection before the regular courts, and such institutions for social betterment as saving banks, land and building associations, and social settlements. All of this vast expenditure of money and brains might have formed a great school of prospective citizenship and solved in a way we have not yet solved the most perplexing and persistent of the Negro problems. That such an institution was unthinkable in 1870 was due in part to certain acts of the Freedmen's Bureau itself. It came to regard its work as merely temporary, and Negro suffrage as a final answer to all present perplexities. The political ambition of many of its agents and protégés led it far afield into questionable activities until the South, nursing its own deep prejudices, came easily to ignore all the good deeds of the Bureau and hate its very name with perfect hatred. For the Freedmen's Bureau died, and its child was the 15th Amendment. The passing of a great human institution before its work is done, like the untimely passing of a single soul, but leaves a legacy of striving for other men. The legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau is the heavy heritage of this generation. Today, when new and vaster problems are destined to strain every fiber of the national mind and soul, would it not be well to count this legacy honestly and carefully? For this much all men know. Despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf States, for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South, the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery, from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In the most cultured sections and cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated servile caste with restricted rights and privileges. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life, and the result of all this is, and in nature must have been, lawlessness and crime. That is the large legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, the work it did not do because it could not. I have seen a land right merry with the sun, where children sing, and rolling hills lie like passionate women wanton with harvest. And there, in the king's highway, and sat and sits a figure veiled and bowed, by which the traveller's footsteps hasten as they go. On the tainted air broods fear. 3 centuries thought has been the raising and unveiling of that bowed human heart, and now behold a century new for the duty and the deed. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So that was Of the Dawn of Freedom. And the central thesis there is that the Freedmen's Bureau, if it was to be effective, cannot be a temporary thing.
That's right.
It had to be an entire restructuring of the national ideal of what a country and a system of government is supposed to be to its people. It is meant to. It had to do the intentional work of prioritizing and giving special treatment. I will say it.
Yep.
Of giving explicitly special treatment to enslaved and poor and poverty-stricken communities, and to continue to do that, and to continue to give them that treatment to uplift them and allow them the space to be this new, educated, broadened, citizenry. That's what the work needed to be and to continue to be. But that in that time was never a possibility. All it was ever meant to do was be a desperate failed attempt, and then it was immediately undercut and thrown away. Now you look at it now, the wealth gap is worse than when Martin Luther King was alive.
Right.
Segregation is worse. These things are still prevalent. Our communities are still poverty-stricken.
Right.
Taxation without representation, like we said, like death of penitentiary. Like we said, when you go to jail, you lose the right to vote.
Right.
And our communities are over-policed, as we know.
Right.
So you go to jail, you lose your right to vote, you can't get it back. You are literally being taxed without representation.
And this idea of, okay, if I could just become wealthy, make more money. Well, guess what? You're on the fringe as well. You're on the outside. Your money none of that makes any difference. Why? Because you're black. Because you're black. And that's the thing that is established early here. We understand that, yes, you want to get from underneath that chain, that boot, and that slavery is the sin of the country. But the reason why you were enslaved is because you are black. The reason why the Freedmen's Bureau, all of these things, is because you were black. Okay? There is no way at this time, with the cognitive dissonance and everything that's going on, that the mental epidemic, that people who, like I said, you were just enslaved just 2 weeks ago, they quote unquote owned you. Now you're gonna get quote unquote special treatment, become equal and educated. No, that's the fervor that all of this is in, and we are still dealing with that ramifications of that even to this day.
So now we are still having this conversation.
Building the schools and the infrastructure, all of those things. Yeah, but the thing is that the mind,
the mental epidemic,
the mental epidemic part
is still prevalent.
It's still prevalent, and we're doing, and like we've talked about, different episodes happening to us now. So yeah.
So in conclusion, the question of the dawn of freedom was, what shall be done with Negroes? The answer was, put them to work.
Yep.
Right? But just pay them this time. And in that respect, it was successful. Because today, you're being put to work. You have, you got an opportunity to get a job, an opportunity to make money, to do these things. But the real work, the real progress, because this, what we're saying, right, that's merely evolution, the evolution of our systemic imposed positions in this society. But the real progress was answering the problem of how would it feel like to be a problem. The real progress is, like I said, getting rid of that space altogether, of bridging that divide, of allowing for the growth of a people, both within and without the infrastructure of the country. That is what was needed. We needed to end the mental epidemic, but that was prolonged, and you could say exacerbated, by this desperate attempt at, citizenship for people. It all fell on its face because it prioritized, even on a temporary basis, it prioritized the wrong things. And even those things it could hardly do.
Yeah.
On even those things, you didn't get people any land, and you didn't bridge the divide. You got them in school, right? which gave us like I said, armed us with the education that we needed to know that we were screwed. Right. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
We know it in definite terms now.
Right.
We can read and write and see exactly how we're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's it.
Right.
Because now, like you said, we can't vote.
Mm-hmm.
The South made it its duty to make sure that we couldn't.
Right.
And once again, the wheel turns, and here we go again. It's like
Right.
it's.
Mm-hmm. And you
this,
see it, right.
This is what we mean. Like you said, like you can't put the count your eggs before the hatch, not being able to see the forest of the trees.
Mm-hmm.
It's this mental epidemic. It is this problem of not being able to recognize the personhood of the other. And all the things that contribute to the prolongation, is that a word?
Yeah.
Prolongation of this problem continue to show their faces in, you can say in evolved forms, if you would, but like in the exact same way. Because it's the exact same conversation. If you do this, this, and this, you're going to be able to get out of it.
Yeah.
And you can't.
Right.
Right? That's not how it works. And once again, they're trying to restrict your rights to vote because, everything's solved. Why do we still need these protections? Right. It's like these things happen because of the protections, but now let's just get rid of the protections because everything's solved.
Right.
And it's like, again and again and again and again, you see these things rearing their head because the crux, the true problem
is how folks think.
Is how folks think. How people see each other. How that cognitive dissonance, that veil that obfuscates any true analysis of each other. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments, and thank you for hearing us out.
Thank you.